Monarchs, this is Mrs. Dutro, and today we're going to talk about writing dialogue in narratives. So in other words, this lecture is on how to give your characters a voice. You may notice that I'm dressed as a Viking today for Halloween because at the time that I'm recording this, it is Halloween. And, so you'll have a Viking telling you how to write dialogues and narratives. Your essential question for today is, how can I write interesting dialogue in my short stories and narrative essays? Please copy this down in the essential questions section of your Cornell notes. Now, before we can talk about dialogue, you need to know what the heck it is. So, dialogue is a conversation between two or more people as a feature of a book, play, or movie. But dialogue can also be used as a verb, and it means to take part in conversation or discussion to resolve a problem. Just be aware that there are two forms of the word. In English class, we'll mostly use the noun version of this word. So there are three elements of strong dialogue. There's breaking grammar rules, eliminating he said, she said, and punctuating short utterances and long conversations. So breaking grammar rules in English class, not something you're typically allowed to do, but with dialogue, it's expected. So interesting people rarely use perfect grammar when they speak. So unless your character is a British aristocrat who drinks tea with his pinky sticking out and, uses extremely proper speech all the time, your character should pretty much ignore traditional grammar rules and instead they should mimic real life speech because that's what you do when you speak to your friends. You don't make sure to observe all the rules that Mrs. Dutro has taught you in class. Instead, you ignore all those rules and you just speak the way you want to speak. So real people don't sound like this. They don't say, "Good morning, James. It is nice to see you again." "Thank you, Lisa. You as well. How have you been?" "I have been very well lately. Thank you. How have you been?" That sounds very robotic and boring and just not interesting at all. They don't sound like real people. So instead, this might sound a little bit more familiar. "Hey, James, long time no see." "Lisa, how's it going?" "I've been good, just doing the same old thing. What have you been up to lately?" So in this case, we've ignored those traditional grammar rules. We're not worried about sounding proper. Characters just speak the way they would naturally speak. Your characters should do that as well. So when writing strong dialogue, you should also use punctuation to create vocal intonation. So intonation is the rise and fall of the voice in speaking. So in this example, you could say, "I didn't say he stole the money," right? So in that case, we have the emphasis on I, which indicates that perhaps someone else said that this person stole the money. Or we could put the emphasis somewhere else. "I didn't say he stole the money." In that case, this person is denying that they've even said something to begin with, and they sound a little bit defensive. Whereas if we were to put the emphasis on say, "I didn't say he stole the money," that indicates that perhaps they hinted at it without specifically saying it because maybe they don't want to be held responsible for the accusation. Or we could put the emphasis on he. "I didn't say he stole the money." So in that case, it sounds like someone else perhaps stole the money, not whoever this person is. Or we could put the emphasis on stole. "I didn't say he stole the money." Perhaps he borrowed it instead, is what this particular intonation is indicating or is hinting at. Or we could put the emphasis on the. "I didn't say he stole the money." So perhaps there's two pots of money. There's the one that is for people to use, and maybe there's money that was set aside for a specific purpose, or maybe money that was obtained illegally perhaps. So in this case, they're putting emphasis on a specific batch of money. "I didn't say he stole the money." Well, this intonation shows that perhaps he stole something else, right? Not money, but perhaps he stole some jewelry or something. So when expressing vocal intonation in writing, you could do several things. You could use punctuation. So you can use quotation marks to indicate a question. "Where are my car keys?" That's normal, it's natural, we would expect that question mark to be there. But this is where you can defy some of those grammar rules a little bit. Instead, you could use a period in between each word. "Where are my car keys?" That makes this person sound really angry and impatient, as if perhaps someone is withholding the car keys for whatever reason. You could use an exclamation point. "Where are my car keys?" As if perhaps this person just realized that their car keys are missing and now they're a little shocked and worried about their car keys being missing. Or you could use an ellipsis, which is the dot, dot, dot at the end. Dot, dot, dots usually indicate omission, which would mean that, so in this case, where are my car keys? It kind of sounds like this person is thinking out loud in that case. Or perhaps they're pausing before they say something else, or perhaps they trailed off at the end of their sentence. They were going to say more, but then decided not to. Or we could use an exclamation point and question mark combo. Where are my car keys? Which makes it sound kind of frantic, perhaps. It's a question, and it's also really nervous, really anxious with that exclamation point. You could also use typographical emphasis. And so the one that's most commonly used is the italics. And, that's your slanty words. And so italics, like in this example here, would indicate that the emphasis is on that word. I didn't say he stole the money versus I didn't say he stole the money. Without having the italics there on stole or on I or on that specific word, then we don't know exactly what this person means by this sentence. So you can use italics to really put emphasis on certain parts of your sentence, which can change the meaning a little bit. Bold and underline are not typically used with dialogue. Next step is to eliminate the he said, she said, and it's all about that action. So, said is obvious, how is not. When you use quotation marks to indicate dialogue, it's obvious that someone just said something because that's what the quotation marks mean, is that someone said something. But it's not obvious how they said it with just the quotation marks. So, I'm going to give you a new writing challenge. Instead of saying the word said all the time, eliminate that. It's redundant. You don't need to say that someone said something because your quotation marks tell us that they said something. So instead, you're going to use a word that describes how they said it. So you could use anything from this list. You have nearly 200 words here. Exclaimed, replied, questioned, murmured, uttered, warned, threatened, tattled, shrieked. All of these indicate something different. If you have someone who tattled, it could be like, so-and-so did this to me, right? It makes that tattletale voice pop up in your head. Whereas if you were to say spluttered, it indicates that they perhaps had trouble getting what they wanted to say out. So these words are much, much more descriptive than just said. Said is so boring. It doesn't tell us anything that we don't already know. Whereas these will give us a lot of information about what your character is saying, and it'll really help to paint that picture in the mind of your reader. You can also make a character do something as they speak. So let's look at this example. Come on, Sally, Billy prodded. Please, just the one assignment. I can't get another 0. I don't know. Sally glanced over Billy's shoulder and her eyes lit up. Oh, here comes Mr. Means. Gotta go. So in this case, we've interrupted our dialogue with Billy prodded, right? So in that case, we have one of those alternatives to said. But if you look at the second part of that example, I don't know, Sally glanced over Billy's shoulder. So by adding that action, Sally glanced over Billy's shoulder and her eyes lit up. That indicates that she's really excited that this character, that Mr. Means just showed up because she really didn't want to be in this situation with Billy. The ellipsis, I don't know, ... doesn't necessarily indicate as strongly that she wanted to be out of that situation, but her actions speak way louder than words. We already know that when people communicate, they communicate non-verbally way more than they communicate verbally. The things that we do say much more about us than the things that we actually say. And that's why when you're trying to figure out if a character's lying or if a person's lying, you pay attention to their body language because their body language will give a lot of that away. But in this case, we don't have body language, right? Unless we tell the reader what that character's body language is. So use actions to indicate how a character feels about something and how they say something. So let's look at another example. Mr. Means picked up a piece of chalk and started scratching something on the board. Now, I want everybody to write this down in your notes. His voice was muffled with his back to the class. So in this case, we have description of his body language, what he's physically doing, his action, and then we have more description of how he sounds. So we have a lot of imagery surrounding this quote, and it's very clear that Mr. Means is the person who's talking. We don't need to say said. We don't need to describe how he said it using one of these words. Instead, we could just describe what he was doing and embed that dialogue in there. Now, when you are writing dialogue, it's very important that you pay attention to your punctuation for both short utterances and long conversations. So I lied a little bit when I said that you got to ignore all the grammar rules. So you can ignore the grammar rules with everything that's within your quotation marks, but you still have to follow the grammar rules with everything outside of your quotation marks. And there's still rules for things that are within, it's just not as strict. So let's take a look at that punctuation. So you have to make sure that you format your dialogue correctly so it makes sense. There are 3 rules you must know when formatting your dialogue. For every new speaker, you have to have a new line. You have double and single quotation marks, and they do different things. So you need to know how to use both of those. And you also need to know how to use sentence punctuation with dialogue. So every time a new speaker speaks, you place a line of dialogue on a new line. And you need to indent every new line, but only the first line of the dialogue. So let's look at this example from Hills Like White Elephants by Ernest Hemingway. So we have the hills across the valley of Ebro were long and white, blah, blah, blah. So that whole first paragraph is just description. It's just giving us background information on this setting. And then we have our dialogue, and our dialogue is set up from our description. What should we drink? The girl asked. And notice how that dialogue is indented. She had taken off her hat and put it on the table. So we have some description showing us that perhaps she's a little casual. It's pretty hot, the man said. But in this case, you can still see how he indented and used a new line for the new speaker, which is the man. You also need to use double and single quotation marks appropriately. So dialogue is always framed with double quotation marks. Every time a character begins speaking, you need to use double quotation marks at the beginning of their statement, and then use double quotation marks again at the end of the statement. Don't separate the sentences with quotation marks. That's a really big mistake that kids always make when they're trying to use dialogue for the first or second or third time, and they haven't been corrected. When you're writing dialogue, you only put the quotation marks around the full quote, whether it's multiple sentences or just one sentence, or even just a couple of words and not even a full sentence. So don't separate the sentences with quotation marks. Only use quotation marks to begin and end dialogue, no matter how long it is. If you want to have a character explain what another character said, that's when you use single quotation marks to set off the quote within the dialogue. So that's a quote within a quote. So check out this example below to see all 3 rules in action. Sally crossed her arms grumpily. I can't stand Mr. Means, she huffed. He's always saying things like, Sally, put your phone away, or Sally, quit putting your makeup on in class. I'm sick of him always being on my back. So in this case, we have our dialogue framed with multiple quotation marks, right? So the only reason that we stopped our quotation marks initially after I can't stand Mr. Means is because we've interrupted our quote so that we could have she huffed. So we could give some information about what she was doing, how she said this. And then we start up our dialogue again. He is always saying things like, Sally, put your phone away. So here we have a really long sentence and followed by a shorter sentence. And even though we have 2 sentences in there, we only use 1 set of quotation marks to set that off because we don't interrupt ourselves to give background information or to give narration or to show action. Now, we also have quotes within quotes when she says, Sally, put your phone away, or Sally, quit putting your makeup on in class. Because she's quoting another character, we need to have single quotes to show that it's a quote within a quote, which is why we have the single quotation marks there. Now, when it comes to punctuation in dialogue, there are a few rules to follow. So if you're using an alternative to said at the end of your dialogue, you must end your dialogue with a comma, not a period. The only exemption to this rule is if your dialogue requires a question mark or an exclamation point. So in this example, we have, hey, Sally, have you seen the cat anywhere? Billy called from the other room. In this case, our quote ends with a quotation mark, and that's okay because it's a question. So it's fine to end it like we would normally end it with a quotation mark. But in the next example, no, dear, I haven't seen him since this morning, Sally replied. Because Sally replied is part of that sentence, because it's following up that quote, and because morning would normally end with a period, instead we're going to end it with a comma to show that our sentence continues with how she replied. If you're using an alternative to said at the beginning of your dialogue, you will use a comma between the said word and the dialogue. So, for example, we have Billy called, hey, Sally, have you seen a cat anywhere? In this case, we have our comma leading into our quote after called. And then again, we see it with Sally replied, "No, dear, I haven't seen him since this morning." So our comma must go after replied and before our quote, "No, dear," because we have our said alternative at the beginning of our quote. And then if you are interrupting a character's dialogue to demonstrate action, you should end the dialogue with a comma unless you need a question mark or an exclamation point. And then in that case, you should use a period or a comma at the end of your interruption. Then continue your dialogue as usual. So we have the example, "Hey, Sally," Billy called from the other room. "Have you seen the cat anywhere?" "No, dear," Sally replied. "I haven't seen him since this morning." In this case, we have an interrupter. By putting a period after replied, we're showing that Sally would have made a full stop after "No, dear." And you can see in our first two examples, we would normally end dear with a period. And then in our first example, we ended dear with a period. So in that case, we would end replied with a period. But in this example, Billy called, "Hey, Sally, have you seen the cat anywhere?" He uses a comma in this dialogue. And so we use a comma after room to continue the flow of the original sentence or the original quote. So a quick review. To write strong dialogue, you should break grammar rules by mimicking the way people actually speak instead of using proper dialogue, and by using italics and punctuation to hint at the intonation that the character is using. You should eliminate he said, she said, and instead use a word or a phrase that describes how the character said something instead of stating the obvious he said, she said. You should also punctuate short utterances and long conversations correctly by using a new indented line for every new speaker, by using double quotation marks to indicate dialogue and single quotation marks to indicate dialogue within dialogue. And you should punctuate correctly, whether you open with the said alternative, close with it, or interrupt your dialogue with it. Make sure you use commas, periods, question marks, and exclamation points appropriately. And that's all I have for you for today. Please make sure you chunk your notes. Also, make sure you write your possible test questions in the questions section of your notes. Highlight those key ideas and key words, and make sure you summarize your notes by answering the essential question using just like 3 to 5 sentences in the summary section of your notes. If you have any questions, you can check out my website at mrsdutro.org, or you can shoot me an email at kelly.dutro@aps.edu, and I will see you tomorrow.